This year marks the 53rd anniversary of the assassination of John Fitzgerald Kennedy, gunned down in Dealey Plaza in Dallas on November 22, 1963. Over the years, the government's official version of events has remained consistent that a lone gunman, Lee Harvey Oswald, was solely responsible for the death of our 35th president. It was a conclusion reached by the Warren Commission, impaneled by Kennedy's successor, Lyndon Johnson, to investigate the circumstances surrounding the murder, a murder which elevated Vice President Johnson to the presidency of the United States. Yet, from the very beginning of that investigation, questions and skepticism arose among millions of Americans who doubted that their government was providing the real story behind the event which changed the nation and the world. Among the earliest critics was well-known forensic pathologist Dr. Cyril Wecht, who believed then, and still believes now, that the known facts of the Kennedy assassination prove, at the very least, that the killing of the president could not have happened the way the Warren Commission claims it did. He believes there was a conspiracy, and he insists that the government continues to cover up who and what was behind the execution of a president loved by millions and hated by others. As we launch this website dedicated to bringing you as many facts as possible in order for you to arrive at your own conclusions, it is entirely fitting, we think, that we present the case as laid out by Dr. Wecht. Here is the interview, which we hope will help lead you to the truth. Well, I'm here with Dr. Cyril Wecht, the famed forensic pathologist and the consistent debunker of the findings of the Warren Commission concerning the Kennedy assassination. Dr. Wecht, we're coming up on the 53rd anniversary of the Kennedy assassination, the assassination of JFK. And some are wondering, is there any hope that we will eventually get to the real story so many years after the event?
I am not as optimistic as I used to be, I guess, in my younger years. I always stated many years ago that the truth would be revealed sometime in my lifetime. I think that is not going to happen. However, I think eventually the truth will emerge. Right now, there is hope based upon the fact that in 1992, the United States Congress passed the JFK Records Act, which calls for the release of all the remaining documents, materials, papers that are in the government's possession, the JFK assassination, in 25 years. That will be next year. So we, a group that has been recently formed, Citizens Against Political Assassinations, CAPA, are reaching out to various people who have been involved previously, and we're contacting individuals, and we'll intensify those efforts after the election hullabaloo is over, going into next year, to try to get everybody in place to push hard for the full release of those documents as required by congressional enactment.
All right, the requirement is one thing, but getting Congress to actually follow through is another. And how hopeful are you of that?
Well, the federal government ignored the United States Congress in 1979, when after 3 years, the assassination committee was set up, the House Select Committee on Assassinations, in a bipartisan effort to review the assassinations of JFK and Dr. Martin Luther King. And I was on that forensic pathology panel, as you know. And the United States Congress, after all of the panels reported to it and all of the testimonies were given, recommended that further investigation should be done, and they said there was most probably a conspiracy. And yet the federal government, the CIA, the president, FBI, they ignored the United States Congress. So how realistically optimistic can I be? You raise a good question.
Dr. Wecht, has there been any production of any significant new evidence over the past few years concerning the Kennedy assassination? I mean, we know the work you and others have done for decades now, but has there been any significant new evidence produced in recent years?
I am not aware of any new evidence in terms of papers, letters, things of a documented nature. I am very much aware of some new evidence that we have and we want to further pursue regarding the scientific medical investigation and analysis of materials at the National Archives. Several people, Dr. Gary Aguilar, Dr. David Mantic, recently Dr. Michael Chesser, have examined these materials and followed through on some things that they discovered, some things that I had originally mentioned following my review in 1972, that show an examination of the x-rays using new techniques, neuroimaging, that the findings as set forth in the autopsy report are simply incorrect. Not a matter of subjective interpretation, but factually, investigatively, analytically incorrect. And we want to go back to the National Archives, and we've requested this. So far we have been rebuffed, but we're going to keep following through on this. That will be important expertise that can be applied in a very solid, tangible nature to show that the Warren Commission report is wrong.
Can you be a little more specific about that evidence?
Yes, the evidence that I'm talking about shows the defects in the skull of the president to be quite different from what the autopsy pathologist reported. Now, of course, we knew that before in the fashion that you would expect by comparing the findings and the observations of all of the doctors at Parkland Hospital contrasted with the findings of the autopsy pathologist. You have these people in the autopsy room, and these opinions were expressed right then and there before anybody had a chance to try to manipulate and alter their observations in a testimony. And they included observations by many top people, including Dr. Kemp Clark, a renowned neurosurgeon who talked about cerebellar tissue and so on, who talked about the big defect in the back of the head. And yet in the autopsy report, the cerebellum, that part of the brain that's located posteriorly and inferiorly, was intact. And according to the autopsy report, there's just a small defect in the back of the skull and so on. So we knew this from before. Now, with these neuroimaging techniques, then we can show in a more definitive technological fashion that what the autopsy pathologist reported was absolutely incorrect. Whether it was contrived, manipulated, whether it was a combination of their incompetence, these two guys, Humes and Boswell, the pathologists at the hospital there, never having done a gunshot wound autopsy in their entire careers, that remains to be seen. We're not looking to bring charges against anybody. We just want to get the truth out. That's what we want.
You know, some people say that in the fog of the events, it was such a crisis situation that there was a lot of perhaps sloppy work and a lot of things that were rushed, and therefore there was no real pattern of intentional misconduct or contrivance, but it was just such a mess. It was such a strain on everyone that a lot of things got jumbled. Do you buy that argument generally?
No, I don't, and I'll tell you why, Larry. Think about it. The assassination occurred, let's talk Eastern Standard Time, about 12:30 Central Time, okay? The autopsy did not commence until about 8 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. So you've got all that time to get things together. They had all that time to reach out to the top forensic pathologists in the country to get them there to do the autopsies. Dr. Milton Halpern in New York and Russell Fisher in Baltimore and Jeffrey Mann in Virginia. They were right there within an hour's drive or an hour's flying time. And in fact, they expected to be called. So you had a period of time in which everything could be put together in an orderly fashion and make sure that the top people were around, extremely competent, experienced forensic pathologists. So the argument that things were rushed because of the hectic, frenzied nature of this and so on, it just doesn't really play out when you think about it. It is not as if something was being done right away. So no, this was something that was definitely manipulated, definitely put into motion by the government, and that's why the autopsy was put into the hands of two career military pathologists and a third one, Pierre Fink, rather than reach out to the top civilian forensic pathologists whom they knew they could not control, whose reputations of 40, 50 years were not going to be given up and torpedoed because the government wanted to cover up the truth about what happened in the assassination.
In fact, there have been quotes from people who were there at the autopsy after the body was flown back to Washington that some military people, unidentified but of high rank, were calling the shots, telling the doctors what to examine and what not to examine.
Yes, well, that is even, I think, recorded to some extent. But you are absolutely right. I have heard this, and it has been documented. We came to learn that there were, I think, up to 33 people in and out of the autopsy room that evening, including some high-ranking, I think, 4-star admirals and generals. And there's one specific instance when Dr. Pierre Fink, who did have a little bit of experience, he arrived an hour late, not his fault. He was just notified, an Army guy from Washington, D.C. at the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology. When Pierre Fink asked about doing something, dissecting out something further, a voice from the gallery said, Dr. Fink, just proceed. We'll tell you what to do. So it's a matter of record. Now, can you imagine, just think about that in an academic setting, let alone something that is as important as the assassination of our president. I mean, it's the kind of a thing, Larry, that we say, well, what did you expect from this third world dictatorship? What would you expect from this society that we denigrate and look down upon? This is America, the land of democracy, right? The land of truth and revelation. Well, anything but that insofar as this case is concerned.
One of the key elements of the assassination that you disputed from day one practically was the so-called magic bullet and the magic bullet theory, which was constructed by Arlen Specter, who later was the senator from Pennsylvania, and he was also the chief advisor or counsel on the Warren Commission.
He was junior legal counsel at that time.
Yeah,
he was. He had been district attorney. He came to be district attorney of Philadelphia, and then he went on to become U.S. senator.
Yeah, well, the magic bullet theory, you say, is physically impossible, according to the laws of physics.
Yes, I wish that I could set this up for you. Like I always do when I speak about this case, I get two people from the audience, I put them in the chairs, and this is the president and this is the governor. 30 inches separated the president's chest from the governor's back, Governor John Conley. And you have the bullet having been fired, according to the Warren Commission, from the 6th floor window, southeast corner, Texas School Book Depository building. So the bullet comes in and it hits the president in the back, about 5.5 inches or so below the shoulder level. To begin with, the bullet exiting from the front of the neck, which, by the way, was a wound that the pathologists, in their total incompetence, didn't even recognize on the night of the autopsy. It wasn't until the next day that they learned that there was a bullet hole in the president's neck, because they thought they were looking only at a tracheostomy, which indeed had been superimposed upon the bullet wound. So the bullet goes into the back. It has an upward angle of 11 degrees through the throat to begin with. Now then the bullet emerges and it's moving downward, leftward, and forward. Just picture, as we're talking, you got two people seated in tandem, one directly in front of the other. The bullet is moving in that fashion as I'm showing here. The bullet has to come over about 18, 20 inches to the right to slam into Conley behind the right armpit. In the autopsy report, right posterior axillary area, which is medical language for behind the armpit. Okay, so we're not talking about a bullet grazing the governor on the left side. Now the bullet then goes into the governor's chest, pierces the lung, destroys 4 inches of the right fifth rib, and then exits below the level of the governor's nipple on the chest. And you can see this again, their autopsy diagrams, not what I'm interpreting. The bullet is moving again downward and leftward and forward. You look at the Zapruder film, the most important documentation of what transpired that day in Dealey Plaza, and you will see at 1/18-second intervals, which is what the Zapruder film shows when analyzed, Governor Conley's white Stetson hat at all times is being held here at about shoulder level, definitely high up in the chest. So that bullet emerging from below the level of the nipple, moving downward, has to come up and around to slam into the governor's wrist. It shatters the distal end of the radius, a large bone in the governor's forearm, one of the two bones from the elbow to the wrist, emerges from the front of his wrist, goes into the left thigh, and proceeds downward several inches, and then works its way out. The bullet on the night of the autopsy that was allegedly found by a maintenance man at Parkland Hospital a few hours after the presidential entourage had left on a stretcher by the emergency room. On the night of the autopsy, that bullet was said to have been from the president's back. When he lay on the stretcher and the doctors applied pressure to the front of his chest, they forced a bullet which had gone into the president's back beyond the length of an adult man's finger, something that just doesn't happen. But that's what they concluded that night. The next morning, when they learned about the bullet hole in the front of the president's neck, they said, oh, the bullet came out, saw the starch white collar, got frightened to death, plopped into the front of his clothing, and that's our stretcher bullet, Commission Exhibit 399. 5 months later, under the single bullet theory, we got the bullet doing everything that I just told you about, and now coming out of Governor John Connolly's left thigh. As I always say to audiences, this is better than any comic book your kids ever have. This bullet will happily and readily accommodate you anything that you want in terms of its trajectory and course. It will present it for you.
In the mainstream media, there have been a number of examinations of the single bullet path, including a big investigative report touted by CBS News years ago. And they say all that could easily be explained away by the positions of Governor Connolly and President Kennedy. They were in jump seats, which were at different levels, Connolly twisting his body, and that bullet did not have to make any kind of severe turns, but could have taken a fairly predictable path, considering the exact positions of the two men.
Yes, I have seen those, of course, on national television, and I've dealt with them. First of all, there is no such a drastic, significant change in the positions. Secondly, Governor Connolly himself always stated from the first news conference that he gave in the hospital room until the date of his death that he heard the shot struck the president, and then he was hit by a separate bullet. And so did his wife, Nellie Connolly, say that. And thirdly, in terms of whether or not there was that kind of change in the juxtaposition of the two men, go back to the Zapruder film at 1/18 second intervals, 18.3 frames of that film move through the camera per second, and you will see for yourself or anybody else, and you will see immediately that there is no such drastic change in the positions of these two men that would have allowed for that bullet to have gone through and made 7 wounds in 2 men, by the way, breaking 2 significant bones in a large guy, John Connolly, 6'4", and emerging pristine with a weight loss of only 1.5% and with no distortion at all of the bullet except at the base from the impact of the firing mechanism. And by the way, keep in mind in terms of the position that while indeed the president's seat was higher, John Connolly was 6'4" and John Kennedy was 6'1". So that 3 inches to a significant degree neutralized the difference in the elevation of the seats in the rear of the car.
A lot could be cleared up if the brain had been preserved properly, and if it was still available, the path of the bullet could have been determined of the fatal shot.
Yes, absolutely. And of course, as you know, it was in 1972, August, when I was given permission as the first non-government sponsored, non-government related forensic pathologist to review the autopsy materials at the National Archives. And I got in there, and it was I that pointed out that the president's brain was missing. Oh, not that I made a discovery that nobody else knew about. All the people who had reviewed it before, including, by the way, the Ramsey Clark panel of distinguished physicians, pathologists, radiologists in 1968. Nobody saw fit to mention that the brain was not there. And you go back to the autopsy report, and you'll see the brain had been fixed in formalin, which is properly done to harden it so that serial sections, parallel sections, can be made to follow the hemorrhagic trajectory of a bullet or bullets coursing through the brain. That when they went back 2 weeks later, on December 6th, 1963, in the autopsy report, in the Warren Commission, 26 volumes, you will see it states serial sections of the brain are not made in order to preserve the specimen. Preserve it for whom? A museum piece on the mantelpiece of Jackie Kennedy or her kids? But nobody saw fit to mention that, including a neuropathologist who also examined the brain at the government's request, who examined the autopsy report. And I trained under that neuropathologist, and I trained under one of the pathologists who was a member of the Ramsey-Clark panel. It just shows you the degree of governmental control and manipulation. It is sordid, it is disgusting, it is inexcusable, it is inexplicable. It is absolutely unbelievable. So the brain, as we talk here today, remains missing. And as you said in your question, indeed, when you then serially section a brain that has been properly fixed, you will see the tracks through the brain of the bullet or bullets. And why do you think that brain was not cut, and why it went missing? Because that would have put the end to their nonsense about one shot coming in from the rear.
In fact, there's never been an explanation of how the brain went missing.
Never. Oh, they'll tell you, the Warren Commission defenders, sycophants, and self-appointed people that buy it. They'll say, "Oh, the Kennedys took the brain." Oh, really? Show me that. I've challenged them repeatedly. Show me one statement, one document, and do you think that the Kennedy family would have wanted to have all of this discussion, including like you and I are talking about today? There's gone on thousands and thousands of times on national TV talking about their father's brain. If they indeed had taken it and buried it, they had a right to do that, if that's what they wanted to do. So you just come out and say, we, the Kennedy family, or whoever, had the brain taken and buried with the president. And that is the end of it. That has never been stated, and it does not exist on record. And that shows you that the Kennedy family did not take that brain, and it was not buried with the president. I don't know where it is, and it's a long time since then.
Years ago, I believe it was in the late 80s, early 90s, when I interviewed then Senator Arlen Specter about the missing brain, and at the time he said he was unaware that the brain was missing.
I don't know how that could be, because in 1972, it was a page one story by Fred Graham, one of the top reporters for the New York Times then. He got the exclusive story with me because he had helped me get in and finally breaking through the obstacles that Burke Marshall, the executor of that phony agreement that the government contrived, that nobody could see these materials for 75 years, with the exception that after 5 years, recognized expert in the field of pathology with a serious historic purpose could apply. So Burke Marshall at that time then in 71, when I applied 5 years later after that agreement, was a professor of law at Yale. So Fred Graham knocked on the door, as a New York Times reporter can do. And so I gave him the exclusive page one story. And it was a big thing covered by news media all over. For Arlen Specter in the 80s or whenever it was that you interviewed him, saying that he knew nothing about the missing brain, that was rather disingenuous, to put it politely.
You say that Specter did, however, attend some of the symposiums that you
he
hosted.
did.
Did he ever express any doubts of his original conclusions?
No, he did not. Even though Senator Specter and I became quite friendly, and indeed I even endorsed him in 2004 as a lifelong Democrat when he was running for re-election, then as a Republican. I endorsed him in 2010, 6 years later, in the Democratic primary, which he lost. So we became friendly. But the answer to your question is no. At our big symposium referred to as the Wecht Conference at Duquesne University, Institute of Forensic Science and Law in 2003, no. Arlen Specter never backed off from what he had said. I was told by somebody who met with him in Philadelphia that he kind of was backing off, and in fact even expressing a almost an apology for it. But I can't tell you that he ever said that to me.
But what was your sense of his position after you became friendly with him and presented all this contradictory evidence, all of your findings that did not match his conclusions? I mean, how did he defend his original conclusions?
Well, in later years, what he did was repeat his conclusions, and then he used the fact that others had confirmed that. The Ramsey-Clark panel in 68, the House Select Committee Forensic Pathology panel, 8 colleagues of mine against me as a minority reporter. So he then would refer to that. he had cushions then, don't you see, which he could fall upon. It wasn't necessary for him to try to explain this in any kind of a scientific fashion. He could just say, hey, look at what all these people said, and they proved that I was right, said he.
Speaking of the Select Committee on Assassinations, most people are still unaware that there was a second finding in the Kennedy assassination. The finding was a conspiracy.
Yes. I bet you that 9 out of 10 Americans, maybe 95 out of 100, possibly 99 out of 100, do not know that. And this just goes to show you another very important aspect of this, Larry, without digressing. And that is, when you don't have the news media behind you, when you don't have the news media reporting fairly, honestly, objectively, and completely, then how far can you go with anything? So here you have the congressional decision, but because it was anathema to the New York Times, Washington Post, et al., all the major magazines and so on, who had come out, all of whom had come out in favor of the Warren Commission report. The New York Times, in fact, tripped over its own feet in publishing their book way back then in '64 and so on. They weren't going to push that at all. And so, therefore, the American public, and this includes people who even know about the case, follow it, do not know, as you have just stated, that the congressional committee, bipartisan, top-level committee, said that there most probably was a conspiracy.
And that was back in, what, 1977, I believe?
Well, the commission was established in '77 and concluded in '79.
After all these years, the Kennedy family has not said very much to contradict the Kennedy assassination. They say that they support the findings. Why do you think that's so?
Well, obviously, I can't speak for the Kennedys. I can only engage in conjecture, as you or anybody else can. And I guess it depends, perhaps, on how you view this case, how you view the Kennedys, and what you think from a psychological standpoint. I think that they came to the conclusion that it wasn't necessary for the country. It would be bad for the country to reveal the truth. It was quickly determined that the Russians, Chinese, and Cubans had nothing to do with the assassination, that it was us, Americans, top-level CIA, military-type people, Allen Dulles, James Adley Phillips, and so on, that were responsible for this. So where were they going with it? Then, too, there were a lot of things in the Kennedys' background. You're going back to the old man and what he did in Prohibition days, what he did as an ambassador to England, trying to defend Hitler and keep us out of the war. Then they're going to move into John F. Kennedy's romantic soirees, bringing Judy Exner and other women into the White House, and so on, and his dalliance, and his brothers, Robert Kennedy, with Marilyn Monroe. All of that would have come out. So I think it's reasonable to conjecture that they made a decision. We can't bring back our father. Where are we going with this? This is our government, and we're not going to dirty and sully his memory and his place in the history books and so on. And then Bobby Kennedy, who did talk about reopening the case, who did say that he wanted to get into it when he was campaigning for president in 1968 before he was executed, that he did say that. And I believe that Bobby Kennedy very likely would have gotten into it. Now, most recently, of course, we have had a comment from Robert F. Kennedy Jr. indicating that he doesn't believe in the Warren Commission, and he's also expressed doubts about his own father's assassination, allegedly by Sirhan, which is a subject for another day. So, but do I think anything is going to be forthcoming from the Kennedy family spearheading this to reopen the case? No, I do not think it is going to happen. Who's around? Just Carolyn.
This is highly speculative, but do you think there's also an element of physical fear if they pursue it?
Well, I don't think so. You do have nephews and nieces and children, but no, I'm not that much of a conspiratorial theorist. That I think, people often ask me about, do I feel that my life is in danger and so on. Well, there's some things that have happened in my life, but you can't go around assassinating everybody who is a critic. And remember this: 65 to 80% of the American public does not buy the Warren Commission report. So where do we start with the assassinations? That leaves us about 250 million Americans to wipe out. I don't think that can be accomplished.
Your conclusion as who were the assassins?
It was us. It was Americans. Who it was, I can't give you the names of the shooters. I don't know the names of the shooters, although some people have said that they were the shooters. You've seen those documentaries, A Prisoner in Federal Prison, named Fowles, and so on and so forth. But insofar as who organized it, I would be willing to bet, Larry, that there weren't more than 3 or 5 people at the very highest level that made the decision that this has to be done in order to make sure that we don't have 13 more years, 5 more of Jack, and followed by 8 years of Bobby. We've got to deal with all these domestic problems here. We've got to deal with Vietnam. We've got to deal with the Cold War with Russia. We've got to deal with Cuba, and we don't like it, and we can't stick around and say, well, let political course run its years. 13 years is a long time in the evolution of a political program in a country. So I believe Allen Dulles played a major role. And this is the irony. This is the unbelievable irony. Allen Dulles is fired by John F. Kennedy.
And he ends up heading the Warren Commission.
He's appointed then to the Warren Commission, and he played the major role. He controlled that commission. Errol Warren and the 2 U.S. senators and the 2 congressmen, they were busy as hell with their own work and so on. And Allen Dulles manipulated the whole thing. And James Phillips Attlee. I mean, these are the guys that ran it. Now, there was input then. They needed things to be done. The military, mafioso, Sam Giancana, Johnny Roselli, Trafficante. Yes, but who called the shots? How could it be accomplished? Only at the very highest levels of government. Lyndon Johnson never bought the Warren Commission. He knew that it was nonsense. Well, what was he going to do? Senator Richard Russell and Congressman Hale Boggs, good old Southern boys, they knew it was sheer nonsense, and they were forced to go along with it. Lyndon Johnson, in typical style, LBJ, he twists a couple arms. It's over. The king is dead. Long live the king.
Which he wanted to be for quite a long time before the Kennedy assassination. We should explore a little bit about the war between the CIA, the military, and Kennedy. I mean, he was disliked from the time he was elected, and after the Bay of Pigs, things got very tense.
Sure. People have to be reminded or informed and educated, most people don't know, not that it's not a matter of record, that the CIA was its own government. Literally, that is not hyperbole. It was its own government. They ran the show and did what they wanted to. And they overthrew Allende in Chile. They overthrew Arbenz in Guatemala. They overthrew the Diem brothers in Vietnam. They overthrew the Shaw. And they did what they wanted to, what they thought was right and best for America. And Kennedy, following the Bay of Pigs debacle, and this is a documented scene, sitting with Senator Mike Mansfield from Montana in his office. He had a piece of paper. He tore it up like this. And this is documented. And he said, this is what I intend to do to the CIA. He knew what he had to do. So there.
Kennedy said he was going to tear it into 1,000 pieces.
Yeah, exactly. They're in the shreds, dismantle the whole operation. And so you have that. And then you have the military people who wanted to drop nuclear bombs on Russia and who wanted to go in and heavily invade Cuba. And then you got the good old boys supporting them in this country in terms of things that the Kennedys were pushing for, voting rights and civil rights and so on. This was a major critical turning point in American history nationally as well as internationally. And this was not something that was going to be tolerated by that cabal.
At the very best, we could say that the rationalization, it was easy for them to rationalize that Kennedy was a dangerous president in terms of national security. Therefore, out of patriotism, he had to be eliminated.
Oh, yes. It wasn't just a personal thing. I'm sure there were some people that disliked him and a lot of people who disliked Bobby Kennedy even more. But I'm not suggesting for one moment that it was done in a moment of anger and personal antagonism. It was, as you just said, this was what was right for America. Super patriotism. These people, Larry, when they hear the Star-Spangled Banner being sung, when they see the flag waving in the wind, they hear and see something that ordinary Americans like you and me, we don't fully hear, we don't fully see, we don't adequately comprehend. They know what is right for America. They know what America must do. And back then, they saw us on a, what do they say, a bucket going to hell, or whatever that expression is, and they weren't going to tolerate it. They were going to do what was right for America.
You know, a lot of people say that after all these years, what difference does it make?
Well,
to find the truth?
Aside from the moral and ethical and legalistic arguments, the difference that it makes is to make Americans more aware of the political process, to make Americans more aware of the manipulative, formidable power of their federal government, to make them aware that, yes, while we're not the totalitarian nations of China and Russia and of other dictatorial nations in the world, that our super secret agencies, CIA and FBI and others whose initials you and I don't even know, that they do exercise a great deal of power in this country, a tremendous amount of power, and that this is not the pure, innocent democracy that we tend to think of, that we must be made aware that the government was overthrown, coup d'etat in America. And if we do not address this, do not recognize and accept this, there is no reason in the world why it cannot be done in the future. So this is something that is necessary not only for history, not only for the Kennedy family, and there's nobody around now that's going to be put in jail. It's not for that purpose either, and it's certainly not for the purpose of posthumously exonerating Lee Harvey Oswald. Who cares about him as an individual? It's done really, if you think about it, for the future safety and welfare of Americans, of our children, of our grandchildren, and for the necessity of recognizing America and reestablishing the United States of America as our founding fathers a couple hundred years ago and longer had in mind and envisioned. That's what it's all for.